Hello and welcome everybody to what I'm calling Bite-Sized Azure. This is the first episode, and what I'm intending to do, or what I'm hoping to do with this, is to pick a feature of Microsoft Azure or Microsoft Cloud as a wider piece and give a very, very quick demo about how to use it or how to enable a particular feature or functionality of that. So we're starting off with episode 1 with Conditional Access Policies. And we're going to enable MFA for external and guest users. So for those of you who are not aware of what conditional access policies are, they're a feature of Azure AD P1 licensing. And what they do is they sort of act as an additional layer of security, or even as a gatekeeper, perhaps, for your Azure tenancy and anything that you're using Azure AD to provide authentication services for. So the way they work is a sort of like a what if type scenario. So when you've authenticated, or when a user's authenticated, you can then run a check against certain signals that that authentication action has produced. So that could be location, could be device, could be a number of different components. In this instance, we're looking at whether the user is part of the domain or whether they're an invited B2B guest user on that scenario, which is quite a common requirement for a lot of organizations. So to set this up, we need to go into Azure AD. So I'm just going to pop over across into the portal. I'm going to go into Azure AD. Now, on the left-hand side here, you need to scroll down a little bit until you get to the security blade and select that. And then at the top left-hand side, you've got conditional access. Now, once you're in the conditional access policies blade, you'll see any conditional access policies that you've already set up. You'll see what their status are and creation date, etc., etc. Now we need to go up in here and go and create new policy. And I'm going to call this external users MFA policy. So the first option is where we want to actually focus on this one, because this is where we're selecting the user types to apply this policy to. And you'll get a number of options here. So we can select all users, which this would then be applicable to every single user who's logging in to this Azure AD instance. Or we can select users and groups, and this is where we want to do. So there's quite handily already an option here to do all guests and external users. So that will be applicable to anybody you've invited into your tenancy on a guest or a B2B basis. Now we're going to select the applications that this is going to apply for. And we've got two options here, really is, which is basically all cloud apps. So basically anything that is authenticating against Azure AD, or we can select individual apps. So we could go in here, for example, and select just the Office portal. But we're going to just do all cloud apps just for ease of use. Let's close that down. Now we've got the conditions, and again, I'm not going to change anything on here because the default conditions will work in terms of applying MFA, but we could narrow that down if we wanted to. User risk and user sign-in are P2 features, so if you don't have Azure AD P2, you won't see those options. But we can look at individual device platforms. So we can say, for example, that their guest user and they're signing in from Android or iOS, or I'm not even sure why Windows Phone is on this list anymore. Perhaps people are still using it in the enterprise. Or we can select locations or specific client apps, etc., etc. But as I said, for the purposes of this demonstration, we're just going to leave that completely blank. Now, this is the important page in terms of this after the setting up of the users. And this is where we're going to say, OK, we're going to grant access, but we're going to make you do MFA. So I'm going to select that. And then we've got the session controls. Now, in real life scenario, you might actually want to change some of the signing frequency or the persistent browser session settings just to give yourself a little bit more control about how often people are forced to provide the MFA. But in this instance, I'm just not going to bother setting any of those up. And finally, before we can actually create the policy, is we've got the option here to do report only, which is actually quite a handy option because this will give you the ability to run the policy for a set amount of time. And then you can see who or what would happen to the users who have logged in. So you'd be able to see on this one, for example, that the number of users that would be forced to do MFA. And if you're doing it around things like device policies or locations, you could see who would be impacted based on those criteria. You can also set it off. I'm not sure why someone would create a conditional access policy and then set it to off. You probably by minimum set it to report only, but I suppose it's possible that you might set it up and then leave it for a little while and then reapply it afterwards. But we need to switch it on, and then we're going to go click on create. Now, the good thing about conditional access policies is that they are applied fairly quickly. I mean, almost instantaneously. So it's good as opposed to other things like, I don't know, what springs to mind at the moment is sensitivity labels, because that can take a little while before they kick in. But that should actually be enabled now. So we'll pop into a different browser, just so that we don't get any session sort of leakage across the two. And I'm going to go into the Azure portal. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sign in as a guest user into my domain. So that's the guest user there. Now what we should see, and but when we go into the Azure portal, because I've picked an account here that's actually got its own Azure subscription, so by default it logs into that Azure subscription. What I need to go and do here is actually go and switch the directory. Now, again, for most users, this would be a lot more seamless, but there we go. So as soon as I've selected that switch directory option, the MFA process is now kicked off. Now, again, typically, all the recommendation would be to use the Microsoft Authenticator app for your second factor authentication. But again, because my mobile phone has been associated with so many accounts, it's actually easier for me to use the SMS for demos purposes. But again, in real life scenario, this would probably be the Microsoft Authenticator app. But anyway, I'm going to ask it to text me. I've got the response. So that is so there we go. So I've authenticated now into the Microsoft Cloud Log directory. I don't have any subscriptions. This user has no rights to that directory, apart from the fact that it's been set up as a guest user. And you can see that MFA was prompted. So that was a very quick walkthrough of how to set up a conditional access policy that would enforce MFA for external and guest users. So thank you for watching. Please feel free to provide any comments or to even subscribe to the channel, and I will catch you for the next episode of this. Thank you very much.